Hello wrestling fans. I am the Pro Wrestle Machine. I've received a ton of requests for this one. Here's a look at Hot Rod Roddy Piper. From the Wrestling Observer newsletter. December 9, 2002. Hulk Hogan and Roddy Piper through the years have been friends, enemies, rivals, dance partners, and the two most important performers in making the WWF expansion in 1984 pay off. They had memorable matches. Wrestlemania 1. The war to settle the score. And even the infamous Age in a Cage years later in WCW. And they are in competition once again, with both coming out with autobiographies just weeks apart and touring at the same time. The positions are familiar. To some, Piper is once again in the underdog role. When Vince McMahon decided he was going to go national in 1984, his two most important acquisitions were Hogan, the hottest babyface in the company, working for the AWA, and Piper, who at the time was a hot babyface working for Jim Crockett, but because of his gift of gab, had the opportunity to be his key adversary as the fast-talking heel manager, the role McMahon's father had built to bring in the new challengers for all the previous babyface champions. The old territory, with its predictably patterned and successful booking, was built around his father's longtime threesome of managers had just about run its course. The Grand Wizard, Ernie Roth, had just passed away. Freddie Blassie was nearly 70 years old and Lou Albano was aging as well. Bobby Heenan and Jimmy Hart had not arrived. Even though Piper had a track record as a draw with strong runs in Southern California, Oregon, Georgia, and the Carolinas, and had become one of the biggest stars in the world. At about 210 pounds legit, although with steroids he got up to about 230, he was considered too skinny by McMahon to be a championship caliber heel, particularly since they would need monsters to oppose the huge Hogan, who was probably close to 320 pounds at that time. But they let Piper wrestle some main events, and he got over better than anyone, particularly in a red-hot feud with Jimmy Snuka and later the Tonga Kid, when Snuka had to be put in rehab. There was a natural Hogan versus Piper feud, and they did many matches and drew some good crowds, but it was never a long-term focused feud because at the time Piper refused to ever put Hogan, or for that matter anyone else, over, for fear of becoming the typical WWF heel of that time, who would have a good run, be fed to Hogan, and be left on the scrap heap. Piper's drawing power on his own was strong enough that he was able to get away with what others would have been let go for. Hogan's face run was long, from 1984 through quitting the company in 1993, with a few lengthy breaks for movies and a nearly one-year sabbatical after mishandling the steroids scandal. Piper's run as a heel lasted just over 2 years, although he remained with the company through 1996 on and off. The 1984-85 period were probably two of the most important years of pro wrestling history. It was the period where the old territorial system, which was doomed by the power of cable television, began to be destroyed. Vince McMahon changed wrestling through the celebrity involvement of Cyndi Lauper, one of the hottest rock stars of the era, Mr. T, the most charismatic television star of the time, and a star-studded lineup with Hogan and Piper as the two big drawing cards. They were the faces on the war to settle the score on February 18, 1985 in Madison Square Garden, which still holds the all-time pro wrestling record for the biggest rating on cable television, a 9.1 on MTV, a number that is likely never to be topped. They were, along with Mr. T, Paul Orndorff just happened to be the fourth guy in that tag match, the people who in one day both made and saved the WWF with McMahon's gamble of a lifetime in Wrestlemania 1 on March 31, 1985 in Madison Square Garden and on closed-circuit television in more than 130 arenas. And they were the stars on May 11, 1985 when NBC put the first Saturday night's main event on in the Saturday Night Live time slot, and drew an 8.8 rating, strong enough that they remained a regular special on the network for the next 6 years, by December 9, 2002. July 31 and August 10, 2015, which point a network of about 24 companies had fallen to 3, 2 of which weren't doing well. While McMahon and Hogan are always credited as the people who made wrestling, and Piper has been frustrated at that list not including 3 names, it took all 3, Mr. T, and Lauper, or things may have been a lot different. Make no mistake about it, somebody was going to go national, and the regionals were going to be history. Had this period not happened and Vince McMahon not tried or succeeded, it would have been someone else, although it's hard to say who. Most likely Jim Crockett Jr., because the Bill Watts/Ted Turner deal that never fully materialized only came about because Turner was mad at McMahon, who probably would have cut in the regional promoters and run everything if he could have handled the expansion costs. Verne Gagne, with Hogan, would have surely tried, but the AWA product featuring so many old-timers would not have worked anywhere where the fans were used to younger and faster wrestling, and Verne Gagne's ideas on promoting would have done him in outside the territory he was entrenched, even with Hogan on his side. He also would have been unwilling to take the gambles that McMahon took, and thus never made the rewards that enabled him to succeed in an expensive endeavor. Perhaps an outside force would have gotten involved, like Eddie Einhorn, who tried and failed to go national in the mid-70s with the IWA. But outside forces have been notorious failures at promoting wrestling. It's all interesting speculation, but in March of 1985, a few things were clear. McMahon was on a roll. MTV was interested in jumping aboard. So was NBC, since it was a new avenue for Mr. T, and Hogan and Piper were becoming legit celebrities through getting the rubs from T and Lauper. But 1 week before Wrestlemania, everyone was scared to death. The live venue of Madison Square Garden was sold out for weeks, but this was before pay-per-view existed to any great degree. There were a few systems that offered the show, but economically it may as well have not existed. The success would come from booking 200 major arenas around the country. About a week in, the advances in most places were death, particularly in markets where they had strong local wrestling promotions. They were canceling venues all over the place. Their rivals were openly laughing, knowing that at this point McMahon had gotten himself deeply into debt with television stations since he spent six figures in many markets annually to buy the existing television time away from local promoters who had never paid for time before. Without the big payoff from Mania, they believed his house of cards would collapse. Even McMahon's later version of history will say that, although he sure didn't say it at the time. I'm not sure it's the case. He could have taken in a partner or gotten funding, since the NBC deal was going to be there even if Mania was not a big enough success to dig him out of his hole. With the NBC credibility and the momentum Hogan and Piper had gotten from the Mr. T rub ultimately, they were on the verge of something big and things probably wouldn't have ended up all that different. But at the time that is how things looked to his rivals, and there is also the chance with a failed Mania, they'd be proven right, although that would have at best been a temporary reprieve. It was already known that one of his key stations, TBS, was about to kick him off the air and his adversaries thought the dominoes would start falling, and were naive enough to think the old territorial system would be saved. But after an incredible week of promotion, the walk-ups were tremendous. In all, about 400,000 people in just over 130 venues attended, billed publicly as 1 million fans in 200 venues. It was a huge success. And while there were rocky times, particularly in the early and mid-90s, that was the day which ultimately told the future of the industry. When word got out that Piper and Hogan were coming out with books, there was a lot of talk. The thought was Piper's book would be more honest, if only because honesty was never one of Hogan's strong suits, plus it was well known that the WWE was becoming more paranoid about its books. There was more frustration among those who wrote them, and Hogan's problems over the book were well known. Those involved in the process of late have said there would never be another good WWE book, because they are too paranoid about what would get in. But Hogan's book would likely be the more successful of the two. He'd have the WWE television behind him, and also, Hogan remained in the spotlight longer. While you can make a case that in 1984-85 that Piper was every bit as valuable as Hogan, and he was, Hogan's name ended up far more enduring. At this point, while both books are selling, the response has probably been disappointing, more so for Hogan's book because it has had so much television publicity, with ads not only during WWE programming but TV ads during sports events on TBS and TNT this week. While the book will debut at number 13 on the New York Times list and number 49 on the USA Today list, both numbers are lower than the debuts for Kurt Angle's book or Basil DeVito's History of Wrestlemania, both of which were considered WWE's early disappointments. At press time, the book is only number 433 on the Amazon.com list, well behind the pace of both the recently released Bobby Heenan book and Sex, Lies, and Headlocks. Piper's book with all the publicity at press time ranked number 1042. For a comparison, at the same stage, the Heenan book was at number 182 and the Assail book was at number 24. Hogan and McMahon had another falling out just before the book came out, although publicly Hogan appears to be doing everything to mend the fences. Their disagreements are that Hogan wants to come back and get wins over the top stars, while McMahon thinks his role should be to put over the top stars. Hogan was complaining to friends about the way the book was edited. It's probably not even fair to credit or blame Hogan for what wasn't in his book, and some of what was in it, because it was changed so much. However, the stories that Hogan's book didn't have the glaring inaccuracies most were expecting turned out not to be the case. Hogan never examined wrestling beneath the surface. He was this guy who made wrestling, carried wrestling, and never admitted to any of his failures other than he should have told the truth about steroids while on the Arsenio Hall show. There was no depth regarding the collapse of WCW, instead making Vince Russo and Bill Bush the scapegoats while protecting Eric Bischoff and himself, who got the company into such bad shape they hired Russo as a failed Hail Mary. While Hogan's take on Russo was fair to a degree, WCW had started its downward slide long before Russo got there, and some of the key reasons, such as the constant Hogan push after his drawing power started waning, were never discussed. He talked about the 2 years under Russo being two of the worst of his career, but that's the exaggeration of all exaggerations. Russo came in October 1999, and on his first show in an angle both Hogan and Russo agreed to with no problems. Hogan did his 45th fake retirement as a work shoot by laying down for Sting. Before Hogan came back, Russo was already gone. That brilliant main event finish, not so coincidentally, was the last goodbye rate the company ever did. Hogan was still there when Bischoff and Russo returned. This marriage lasted a few weeks longer, before the infamous Bash at the Beach Works shoot angle, which some people raved about, but check out every buy rate after that show to show what it really meant. In all, the 2 horrible years Hogan worked under Russo was really 2 months. But they probably felt like 2 years. He went out of his way to be nice to almost everyone, to the point he even proclaimed Jay Leno a great athlete who took well to pro wrestling. Even those who loved Leno's involvement in the company admitted he was the single most unathletic celebrity brought in, and they were so afraid of him doing anything but the most rudimentary arm bars that they recruited the more athletic Kevin Eubanks to do what Leno was originally booked to do for the finish. His only knocks were on Mr. T, who everyone in those days hated, but he helped put them on the map, Jesse Ventura, although it led to the most embarrassing chapter in the book, about his run for the presidency, Dennis Rodman, which read like total fiction, probably because Rodman was such a flake and also because Rodman was the one guy who was able to negotiate a better deal from WCW than Hogan. And a little bit on Randy Savage, although that was heavily edited. Piper, on the other hand, was quite willing to admit his own problems and problems with the business, even if he didn't offer solutions or look at those problems in a lot of depth. Piper seems to want pro wrestling to be a better place for ex-wrestlers, as his talk of unionizing wouldn't benefit him, or any of the ex-wrestlers like Terry Funk and Bret Hart who have publicly expressed similar thoughts on the subject, but they have the hindsight of seeing what happened to their contemporaries. Along with Father Jason Sanderson, a longtime fan who became an independent wrestler for a while and won $66 million in Powerball, they are attempting to put together a home where retired boxers and wrestlers, down on their luck, can stay, get some meals and medical care. Hogan got his and really doesn't come across as caring about the profession, even to the point of never once mentioning the near-fatal parasailing accident of his longtime best friend Ed Leslie, although again his book was more heavily edited and for all we know he addressed many issues that ended up on the cutting room floor. Hogan only mentioned Billy Graham, who he took his act from, in passing, noting Graham and Dusty Rhodes were his favorite wrestlers growing up. That after he got big he called Graham up and told Graham his arms were bigger than his. No steroid references to this at all, other than Hogan admitting he started using steroids in 1975 but thought they were safer than eating sugar, and many will laugh at his claim that had he known the dangers he never would have used them. The other Graham reference was when he debuted at a WWF TV taping in 1979 and was wearing tie-dye, and fans started chanting Superstar Graham at him. Vince McMahon Sr. heard it, and immediately told him never to wear tie-dye. While some of Piper's history was a little hazy and at times inaccurate, when talking about drugs in wrestling, he admitted he was right there in the middle of the problems. This isn't close to pure dynamite, and Piper's book falls short, because with the exception of his own thoughts on Russo, heavily toned down. By the way, he largely ends the book around 1992 when he put Bret Hart over at WrestleMania 7 for the IC title and Kurt Hennig took his spot in the WWF broadcast booth, with brief mention of his 1996 WrestleMania match with Goldust and almost nothing about his WCW tenure. Both told the story of WrestleMania 1 from different standpoints. Both noted how the wrestlers hated Mr. T, and while at the time the prevailing public viewpoint was Mr. T was a real tough guy and the wrestlers were phonies, both claimed there was a dressing room filled with guys who wanted to take him apart. One, David Schultz, actually tried and was fired several weeks before the show. For Hogan, he was trying to keep Mr. T from walking off, continuing to promote a show so much was riding on, and at least showing up for the event. For Piper, he was fighting McMahon, who had promised Mr. T would get the final pin, but neither Piper nor tag partner Paul Orndorff were willing to put over an outsider. Orndorff eventually did. Mr. T didn't come off very good in either book, and both noted how, the day of the show, he created a scene and was about to walk off, which literally would have been the biggest disaster in American wrestling history. Hogan wouldn't let him leave and the match took place as advertised. T was more important to Piper, since at WrestleMania 2, Piper inadvertently was turned babyface. By this time the public had turned on T like those who knew him in acting and wrestling already had. Even though Piper did some strong racial angles and was as hated as any heel in the business at the time, he wasn't as hated as T, and with the fans cheering Piper at the Nassau Coliseum in a boxing match that was among the worst high-profile main events in history, he was turned babyface. This created an interesting situation because Hogan was guaranteed the top spot, but at first in most arenas, Piper was more popular and just as big a draw, at least temporarily, as the hot heel who turned. Piper also knew he could never get the top spot, setting up the natural resentment that often happens among McMahon's top stars in a given time period. Piper only lasted another year with the company, and came up with a retirement gimmick as a way to try and get, maybe steal, some of the attention leading up to WrestleMania 3, built around Hogan's famous match with Andre the Giant. At the time he had no intention of retiring, but was going to sit out long enough to at least sort of make the stipulation valid. Piper quit wrestling temporarily to become an actor. His most notable appearance was the lead role in John Carpenter's They Live. Although he did eventually return, but was never able to fully retrieve the drawing power he'd left behind by leaving. When he returned, there was never any controversy where Hogan and Piper stood in the pecking order. In the Pit with Piper, which on the cover states in small print this book is not authorized by or affiliated with WWE, Ghost written by Bob Picciarello, at times feels like an entertaining ramble, going nowhere. He attempts to become deeper on his subject and examine it, but it fell short in that regard as compared to the Foley books. Piper could look back and see that at his peak, and even before he was going out of his mind, and between the high-speed drugged-up sprints from town to town, was probably lucky to be alive with all the risks he took. He understood there was a sickness about pro wrestling, and made no bones that it affected him as badly as anyone. He was fair to Vince McMahon, praising him for his success, and critical of him, and justified and at times not. He blamed McMahon for, in 1991 when several wrestlers, including he and Hogan, were called to testify they purchased steroids from Dr. George Zarian, that Hogan got out and he didn't. That was hardly something McMahon should be blamed for. Lawyers for both went before Judge William Caldwell. He excused Hogan, which was a very controversial ruling, because there was a health condition that Zarian was treating Hogan for at the time that would have been a public embarrassment to him if it had gotten out. Caldwell felt the trial, which was considered something of an open and shut case, would not be damaged, since there were plenty of wrestlers who would be forced to testify to the same thing. Piper's lawyers tried to get him out, but Caldwell turned down their motion. If McMahon had to pick who to be excused, little doubt he'd have chosen Hogan, but it was not his call. Piper also claimed that in 1991, after McMahon fired Jesse Ventura, that Piper signed a 3-year deal to be an announcer. Piper knew his value at the time because losing Ventura could have been a major blow without someone of equal charisma being put in the spot. At the time, Piper was a far bigger star than Ventura, and in 1991, the ratings for primetime wrestling, the forerunner to Monday Night Raw, showed a rare increase against NFL competition. Without telling him ahead of time, Curt Hennig showed up in the studio one day when it was time for voice-overs. They shot an angle, and took his spot. Piper, who claimed to be in the business for 33 years, others will dispute that figure, and trainer Tony Condello said Piper's first match was in 1973, and his final match was in 2000, has often complained about being on Larry King with Hogan and Mick Foley, and when the subject came up, Foley tried to change the subject and asked why Piper, who had so much success in wrestling, was so bitter. Hogan tried to blow the subject off. Piper expected as much from Hogan, but was disappointed in Foley, who he liked and respected. The two do get along, even though Piper questioned Foley taking those bumps in the Hell in a Cell match, as witnessed by Foley, and even more surprisingly Bruno Sammartino, both showing up for Piper's New York book launch. There almost can't be a book by a wrestler without exaggerated tales. As some of the 80s wrestlers who grew up listening to their elders used to joke, the old-timers used to claim they all had occasional shooting matches, which almost never happened, and all the houses were sellouts and near riots. That was the era Hogan and Piper came in during the tail end of, where lying about everything was so inbred that many of the stars had long since blurred truth and fiction. For example, Piper told a story about how he used to clean up former Winnipeg promoter Al Tonko's weightlifting equipment. He said as a rib, he painted the weights on the weights wrong, painting 25 on the 40-pound dumbbells and 95 on the 80s, and laughed at how super strong men Billy Graham and Hercules Cortez would train, and not figure out how come they had suddenly gotten so weak. He claimed they quickly realized they were ribbed, and took it out on him in the ring. Where the story falls apart is that Piper's first pro wrestling match for Tonko was in 1973. Cortez died in an auto accident in 1971. Cortez and Graham never even worked the territory at the same time. He claimed it was on one of those shows, in his debut, that he got the name Roddy Piper, although Tony Condello, his original trainer, has posters of Piper's first pro wrestling match on one of his small indie shows, with the Piper name. Condello claimed he came up with because Roderick Toombs was late for practice one day because he was at bagpipe practice. This was before the match Piper has talked about for more than 20 years that he had when he was 17 years old. He was actually a few years older, against Larry Hennig in his AWA debut, where the ring announcer saw him and called him Roddy the Piper, and the name stuck. In his stories about the 70s, while the timeline wasn't perfect, some ring true. Some aren't able to be confirmed. He talked about a day in St. Louis when the promoter, no name was ever mentioned, called a 320-pound African-American wrestler "you stupid, fucking N-word." Sam Mushnick was the St. Louis promoter, and while he may not have been a trailblazer in race relations, nobody from that period believes the story, as Mushnick was said to have never talked like that, although it has been surmised it could have been one of the owners of the Kansas City Territory or a minority partner in St. Louis, because the N-word was commonly used as a business term for African Americans in the 70s. Piper was working the Kansas City Territory, his first after leaving Winnipeg in late 1974, and was brought to St. Louis to work television jobs, never appearing on the arena shows, as Roddy Piper. St. Louis booker Pat O'Connor, who was notorious for getting names wrong, miscued on him, and since he wasn't a major name yet, nobody caught it. Probably unknown to Piper, Mushnick thought he had a lot of charisma for a job guy, but was worried because he was so skinny for a wrestler in those days. He called Fritz von Erich and got him into Texas. He only wrestled for a short period in Texas, meeting with Red Bastian, who recommended him to Leo Garibaldi, who was booking a dying territory in Southern California. Piper lists that as 1973, but it was actually 1975. Piper failed to recognize the irony that he himself got over in many places, largely through ethnic insults, aimed at Mexicans in Chavo Guerrero in Los Angeles, and at African Americans and Mr. T on the national stage. To this day, Alan Coage, who was wrestling at the time as Bad News Brown, considered it both tasteless and racist that Piper came out in a half-black face in their Wrestlemania match. Los Angeles had been a wrestling hotbed since the 1920s. But business fell hard and fast in 1974 when Mil Mascaras became such a huge international star and stopped coming around, and Fred Blassie retired to move to WWF to become a manager. When KCOP TV canceled the English-language live Saturday night primetime television show, their only outlet was a live Wednesday night primetime show on the Spanish International Network. This was what Piper walked into, and he began a several-year stint there, largely programmed with Chavo Guerrero, as well as brothers Mondo, Hector, and even Father Gory. He ran the gamut, from being shaved bald in a hair versus hair match, to losing a loser leaves town match and coming back as the masked Canadian, and every other angle in between to try and keep the programs going. It is true that Guerrero and Piper revived the territory, and Piper started to build a reputation as a great talker. At their peak, they were drawing 8,000 fans at the Olympic Auditorium on a Good Friday night. Piper did that despite participating in some of the lamest gimmicks ever, and was the last heel ever to draw consistent business on a weekly basis in Los Angeles. In his book, he noted the forgettable hypnotist gimmick, but never really explained how stupid it was. Because he could talk so well and was so skinny at the time, they also thought at first that he should be a manager, starting out managing Java Rook, who was Northeastern jobber Johnny Rodz, trying to be a low-rent version of the Sheik. Piper got so much heat they put him in the ring as a manager to get bounced around by the faces, and drew so much money, he ended up not only as a full-time wrestler, but the top heel and frequent America's heavyweight champion. There was the famous interview where he claimed he could cure people of their problems, going on and on forever to gorgeous Keith Franks, who later became Adrian Adonis, about how horrible smoking was. Can you imagine a 5-minute promo on that? And that he'd be able to hypnotize Franks into quitting his filthy habit. Hypnosis eventually became as lethal as a loaded boot or a foreign object in the mask, or a piledriver in Mexico City or Tennessee to babyface wrestlers. Once the Athletic Commission decreed hypnosis was illegal in pro wrestling, Piper would take out his watch, behind the ref's back, and hypnotize opponents into laying down for him while the announcers would scream, "Ref, he's using hypnosis." That's illegal. Another angle they came up with was timeouts in wrestling, like in football. It became a regular part of the match when the face would get a submission hold on, and the heel, usually Piper, would call for a timeout. He claimed to have met Andy Kaufman, Muhammad Ali, and Lonnie Moondog Mayne during this period. Mayne and Piper was an interesting story which would mean nothing today, but was an example of the outright stupidity of the business in that period. In 1978, the two were feuding with Mayne as the top babyface, in San Francisco. At the same time, the two were tag team partners, with Mayne as a heel, in Los Angeles. The Los Angeles TV show aired live every Wednesday night on the Sin station in San Francisco. Literally everyone knew except apparently Roy Shire, the once incredible landmark booker who had lost interest in the product as his income was dropping. This ended up being one of the things that helped kill the San Francisco territory. Mayne died in an auto accident during this time period. Piper noted that Mayne, who was 34 at the time, was talking about retiring and going into real estate, but then found out he had cirrhosis of the liver and was about to die. The truth was even sadder. Mayne's internal problems were caused from years of eating glass, which was one of his TV wrestling interview specialties he used to get over as being someone who was crazy. He told a story about wrestling terrible Ted there in Fresno for Shire, and that Jay York put honey on his butt, and you can imagine where the bear's mouth spent the match. Many note that story was first told by Killer Kowalski, but theoretically it could have been an old-time wrestling rib, and could have happened more than once. He talked about going to Madison Square Garden during the Los Angeles years and that Blassie put toilet paper in his bagpipes, so when he went to play nothing came out, and his debut flopped, and it was years before he was brought back. Supposedly, Blassie has denied this ever took place. When Piper told the story, he was on a hot streak in Los Angeles and sent by Mike LaBelle to do a one-shot at the Garden. However, records show Piper made 3 appearances in Madison Square Garden before his big run, all after he had left California and was working full-time in Oregon. In fact, in Oregon, promoter Don Owen would talk proudly when doing his ring announcing about Piper working Madison Square Garden or flying out in the middle of certain weeks for WWF television tapings. Piper's first MSG match was January 22, 1979, against, ironically enough, Frankie Williams, the subject of one of the most memorable Piper's pits ever. Many years later, when Piper confronted the jobber and asked him, "Have you ever won a fight in your life?" The second was on April 30, 1979 against another regular television jobber of the time, Steve King. The final was a weird match on July 30, 1979, over former charge rods. The entire match was spent with Piper running away from rods, before cheating and getting a quick win in 2:49. In those days, jobbers never got that kind of offense against the top heels, and the match was so weird that pro wrestling urban legend stories sprung from it, such as how it must have been a shoot because star heels never got treated like that, and everyone knew Rods was a tough guy. But the idea it was a shoot was ridiculous. However, I do recall Piper being brought in from Oregon as the next big heel for a few sets of television tapings in late 1978 and early 1979. There was an appearance when he went to play the bagpipes, and nothing came out. Although Piper had made a rep for himself by then as a big draw and main eventer in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Oregon, he was considered too skinny when he showed up once again, and was never given the push most heels would get in that era. Piper turned babyface for the first time as a headliner in a territory in Oregon in 1979, and was a gigantic hit with his feud with Buddy Rose and tag team with Rick Martel. Already a great talker from Los Angeles, he had gotten better in Oregon, and they were legitimately doing record business. Still, in the territorial days, things were very different. While Piper had done business in Los Angeles, that was a dead territory that didn't count because it was Mexicans, even though it had national exposure. In Oregon, that didn't count because Oregon wrestling got no publicity outside of its boundaries. The places that counted were WWF, Florida, the AWA, Carolinas, Georgia, St. Louis, and possibly Texas, because those places got the magazine coverage and to be a national star. The wrestling mags, who at the time were oblivious there was even a state of Oregon no matter how good business was, were what legitimized you. Piper was not a big national star coming to the Carolinas, like so many who were in the territory at the time. But he was pushed huge, and got over immediately. Piper worked with top international stars, from Ric Flair to Wahoo McDaniel to Jack Briscoe. He was then brought to Atlanta, where he gained his first fame as a national superstar. He was at first not even to be a wrestler, this time, not because he was too skinny to headline. Actually, Georgia was not a big circuit at the time, even though people remember things differently. The Carolinas were big time, but Atlanta had TBS, which meant national television, but most of its cities weren't drawing well. Piper was brought in every Saturday morning to do television commentary on the 2-hour World Championship Wrestling show with Gordon Solie. While Jesse Ventura gets the credit, the heel TV announcer role, which had been done before in other territories, was first used on a national basis in 1981 in Atlanta. Piper claimed that Jim Barnett hated his work and wanted him gone, although Barnett remembered things differently, but either way, ratings went up noticeably, although the frequent appearances of Ric Flair as world champion and Dusty Rhodes were probably as important. Piper's claiming rating turned around in 1 week was exaggerated. But World Championship Wrestling on the Superstation went from averaging a 5.1 rating before Piper to a 6.6 in 1982, with Piper, and becoming the first television show in the history of cable television to top 1 million homes weekly. Piper talked about being signed to a $5,000 per week contract for this, but that was also an exaggeration, as nobody in wrestling except maybe Andre the Giant was making that kind of money every week, let alone just for announcing on television. The real figure was probably closer to $5,000 per month, which was substantial, and with the company operating in the red, they couldn't afford it and breached the contract. Piper insulted all the babyfaces at will, but for whatever reason, his most memorable stuff was for a mid-card babyface named Bob Armstrong. After months of build-up, they had a match. The usual Friday night crowd of 4,000 at the Omni really did swell to 12,000. However, Piper saying they consistently did $60,000 houses with him was an exaggeration as well. Barnett knew the first big house was due to Piper and told Booker Ole Anderson that whatever he did, he wanted Piper's hand raised. Anderson, who saw Piper as a Charlotte guy and Armstrong as his weekly guy working all his towns, made the booking decision to do the opposite. On the first match in for the hottest heel in a long time, he had Armstrong score a pin right in the middle. Yes, stupidity in booking has a long history. While Piper remained a good draw, it took the luster off quickly. Eventually Piper was fired for showing up 3 hours late on a house show when he and Tommy Rich got lost on the way to Chattanooga. Piper talked about how he and Rich, the top babyface in the territory at the time, were way out of control, between the drugs and car wrecks. But for longtime fans, another weakness is lack of checking things out. For example, the Iron Sheik's real name, Hossein Khosrow Vaziri, was listed as Cosmo Hussery. The famous Jack Veneno vs. Ric Flair match in Santo Domingo that Flair wasn't supposed to lose the NWA title in, but they called an audible because Flair and Piper, who was at ringside for the match, was scared to death as the crowd of nearly 30,000 at a baseball stadium was about to riot and guns were even pulled. Flair just laid down and told Veneno to pin him was talked about. Flair left the building with the NWA title, although Veneno did claim the title in front of his home fans. Piper listed the wrestler's name as Jack Benitez. That's more the fault of Picarello, because that's research that isn't exceedingly difficult to come by, and that's the role of a ghost writer in these type of books. What was funny about the story of the match in Santo Domingo is that Piper has been frustrated nobody believes that story, and that's pretty much how most accounts from that time period had it going down. He claimed the original Starrcade was built around himself, Flair, Harley Race, and Greg Valentine. That's debatable. Flair vs. Race was clearly the main event. The second bout from the top was Ricky Steamboat and Jay Youngblood vs. Jack and Jerry Briscoe, although his dog collar match with Valentine, which ended up being very famous at the time because of how brutal it was a very strong attraction on that show. Piper was actually only with the promotion a few more weeks. In the book, Piper went out of his way to put over Flair, claiming in the 70s that he was the young star on the West Coast and Flair was the hot young star on the East Coast. The two ended up being major rivals and close friends. Piper was in Flair's wedding party, and even this past week, the two had Thanksgiving dinner together. Piper didn't start back with Crockett on the traditional Christmas shows, as he debuted on December 27, 1983 as a manager of David Schultz at the WWF television taping in St. Louis at the Chase Hotel. Piper really was a unique individual in WWF. He once walked out on the company in the middle of a hot run, I believe this was after Wrestlemania 2, or 7 weeks renegotiating his contract, which was unheard of. He was a heel who refused to do jobs, and got away with it, also unheard of. When McMahon went national, for years he refused to work any house shows in either Oregon or the Carolinas, where if anything, he'd be a bigger draw because of his history, out of loyalty to both Don Owen and Jim Crockett Jr., although he did eventually have to give in on that point. Once, in the middle of his WWF run, right after the first Wrestlemania, when Piper was the hottest heel on a national basis in decades, when Owen was doing an anniversary show and his biggest show in company history, Piper did the unthinkable at the time, crossing party lines and worked the Owen show against old rival Rose, as a babyface alongside many of the NWA's biggest stars like Flair, getting the biggest pop of the show. While under contract to McMahon, he worked unofficially as the booker for Don Owen, helping out official booker Lynn Denton, and his creativity at the time was such that it led to the last hot period of Owen's promotion. The chapter Piper said would be the most interesting was called The Sickness, dealing with the deaths of so many wrestlers. He recognized wrestling could be a tragic profession, and how he could have easily been one of the tragedies. But while mentioning the various tragedies, he didn't really tie them in well together. He talked about his own stupidity in wanting to make his matches seem real by having a car run over him as part of a stunt in the pre-taped portion of his 1996 WrestleMania match with Goldust, which was his final high-profile match with the company. Overall, the book ranks somewhere at the high end when it comes to wrestling books. It's not top 5, but one that most older fans would enjoy. They will like it because it has a lot of talk and atmosphere about wrestling in the 70s and 80s and his mindset and how he worked and talked. He talked about a period in wrestling many would think, once he became such a big star, that he'd forget about. Newer fans will be disappointed because the modern era and 1997 to 2000 boom period is barely touched on, nor his thoughts of being part of the boom and bust of WCW, and it's too bad because he had some very strong opinions about that situation. With the exception of the exaggerated Atlanta contract, his earnings were never discussed, which is his private business, but I'm sure people would be interested in what kind of money he was making in the big years, or for Mania, as well as his reasons, financially, for leaving WWF and getting a tremendous contract from WCW, as well as its ending with nasty lawyers' letters back and forth, including him being terminated for not being able to pass a physical due to having an artificial hip. He had the hip put in long before ever joining the company in the first place. People who are sticklers for details won't like that. Piper claimed the only guy he did a job for in WWF was Bret Hart at Wrestlemania in 1992. Actually, he also did jobs for Ric Flair and Rick Rude numerous times, but never did one for Hulk Hogan until both were in WCW and Hogan did the first one, albeit in a non-title match. But the talk about the mid-80s period, when wrestling changed, through the eyes of one of the guys who made it a success, was about as detailed as you're going to get like Piper. The book isn't very focused, and those who are looking for a lot on McMahon and Hogan in that famous period will only get a small dose. July 31, 2015. TMZ.com reported Friday that Roddy Piper, born Roderick George Toombs, has passed away at the age of 61. The site reported Piper died of cardiac arrest in his sleep Thursday night in Hollywood, California. WWE made a statement. WWE is deeply saddened that Roderick Toombs, aka Roddy Piper, WWE Hall of Famer and Intercontinental Champion, passed away today at the age of 61. WWE extends its sincerest condolences to Toombs' family, friends and fans. Vince McMahon made a statement as well. Roddy Piper was one of the most entertaining, controversial and bombastic performers ever in WWE, beloved by millions of fans around the world. I extend my deepest condolences to his family. Piper was one of the key figures in the growth of WWF. In particular, he helped power the success of the first Wrestlemania, the most important show in company history because it was such a make-or-break event. He was considered one of the greatest promos in pro wrestling history, competed in all of the major organizations, and while he never won a world title, he held the WWF Intercontinental title and the WWF Tag Team titles, with Ric Flair. He was named to the WWE Hall of Fame in 2005 and was an actor in a variety of lead and supporting roles in B-movies and TV series like the infamous They Live, Body Slam, and Hell Comes to Frogtown. He appeared in the popular FX series It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia as the Maniac, a pro wrestler. Piper leaves behind his wife, Kitty, 4 children, and 1 grandchild. August 10, 2015. Just when they think they've got all the answers, I change the questions. Roddy Piper, whose incredible work as a heel outright changed the complexion and history of pro wrestling, passed away at his Hollywood home, in his sleep on July 30th, at the age of 61. My name is Roderick George Piper. Roderick, that's Gaelic for conqueror. George, that's Gaelic for George. Piper was found dead the next morning. According to the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Office, Piper, born Roderick George Toombs on April 17, 1954, suffered a blood clot in one of his lungs, which, combined with suffering from hypertension, caused a fatal heart attack. There was no evidence that anything passed that caused the death, and there is set to be no further examinations. When Vince McMahon started his national expansion by doing a television taping in St. Louis, Missouri, on December 27, 1983, Hulk Hogan, Roddy Piper, David Schultz, Hogan's rival at the time in AWA, and announcer Gene Okerlund, the AWA's top announcer, were expected to be the key new players. Unlike many who left their companies like the AW with no notice and just never came back to work, Piper went to Jim Crockett and told him the offer he was getting. Even though Piper was Crockett's second most popular wrestler at the time, behind only world champion Ric Flair, Crockett, not fully realizing what McMahon was planning, encouraged him to take the offer, and Piper even came back after working WWF tapings to finish up his last week of dates with Crockett, including coming back for a series of dog collar matches with Greg Valentine. Out of respect for Piper, Crockett didn't even have him lose in all the key cities on the way out, as he won his last match in almost every key market. In March, he actually worked 4 dates for Owen that he had promised before signing with McMahon. teaming with former heel rival turned face Buddy Rose. At another point, he raised the ire of McMahon, as he agreed to work Don Owen's biggest event of the decade, the May 21, 1985, Owen family's 60th anniversary show in Portland, and even though he had just done the first Wrestlemania and was the biggest heel wrestling had seen in the modern era on a national basis, the fans in Oregon considered him a returning hero, showing his local visibility that had for the most part ended in 1980, 5 years later, meant more in that area than all the national television of the prior several years. When McMahon expanded nationally, Piper went so far as to tell McMahon he would not work any dates for WWF in either the Carolinas or Oregon because of how well Crockett and Don Owen treated him. And for years, he kept to his word. Not one other wrestler during that expansion period would do that, passed aside from giant Baba loyalists like the Funks, who at the time would not go to Japan against Baba when WWF still worked with New Japan. Weeks before his WWF debut, Piper was in perhaps the second biggest match, underneath the Flair vs. Race match, at the first Starrcade, where he beat Greg Valentine in a bloody dog collar match after an angle where Valentine destroyed Piper's ear and in storyline, took away much of the hearing in one of his ears. In actuality, the injury was to set up Piper going on a tour of all Japan Pro Wrestling, but Piper would always insist the injury was real and that he had lost much of his hearing in one ear. When Piper had to do a Piper's Pit with Valentine, McMahon was all about pretending that everything that happened elsewhere had never taken place, but Piper subtly brought up that even though both were heels, that the two had their problems in the past. Piper was actually brought in to be a wrestler/manager. At the time, Piper was considered the best talker in the business, but there were concerns over his size. In 1979, after he was already established as a money-drawing heel for years in Los Angeles, by that time had moved on to Oregon, he was brought to Madison Square Garden for a few prelim matches. Given the Wednesday night matches from the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles aired in New York on a 2-week tape delay, a large part of the fan base was already familiar with him. There was talk of bringing him in as a heel contender for champion Bob Backlund, but after seeing him, Vince McMahon Sr. felt he was too skinny, and it was felt he largely flopped. Piper claimed that Freddie Blassie stuffed Piper's bagpipes with toilet paper, and his gimmick that made him unique from early in his career was playing the bagpipes before his matches. He started to play and nothing came out, and he in 1 second turned into opening match comedy. Whether true or not, after he'd gotten a couple of prelim wins at the Garden over Frankie Williams, who he later had a memorable Piper's Pit with more than 5 years later, and Steve King, in his third MSG bout, he faced prelim veteran Johnny Rodz on the July 30, 1979 show. Rodz pretty much ate him up, making him look weak, before putting him over in 2:49, but it was in the most unimpressive fashion. Piper was scheduled to start at television the next day to build for a run with Backlund, but he looked so unimpressive against Rodz that the plans were dropped. Over the next 5 years, Piper's star grew greatly. He became the most popular babyface the Pacific Northwest had seen since the heyday of Lonnie Main. He went to the Carolinas, the most talent-rich promotion in the U.S., where his talking and wrestling was strong enough that he became a super heel and then the company's number 2 babyface. He was introduced in Georgia as a television announcer, the sidekick of Gordon Soley. While he was not the first heel color commentator, he was the first to play the role on a national basis. He was an enormous success in the role. In 1981, Georgia Championship Wrestling, airing from 6:05 to 8:05 p.m. on Saturday nights, averaged a 6.4 rating and was the second highest rated cable television show in the country. The highest, believe it or not, was the Sunday 1-hour highlights package, which averaged a 6.6. At a time when pro wrestling was filled with great talkers, Piper was largely considered the best. But the WWF clearly had its qualms, introducing him more as a manager who sometimes wrestled, as opposed to a main event wrestler. It really wasn't until 3 months later, a March 25, 1984, Madison Square Garden show where Piper and Schultz wrestled Andre the Giant and Jimmy Snuka. The show drew a double sellout, both Madison Square Garden and the adjacent Felt Forum, with roughly 24,000 fans, billed as 26,092, for a rare WWF show without a WWF Championship match on top. While Backlund vs. Greg Valentine was the main event and the Piper tag was second from the top, the superheat between Piper, Snuka and Andre blew away the reaction of anything else on the show. The key was that Andre, who liked Piper from years earlier, sold big for Piper's boxing-style offense. Andre usually would only sell like that for the biggest heels, but the people bought it, and the WWF largely pulled him from the manager role and went with him as their top heel. They gave him Piper's Pit, a talk show segment built into the television show, where Piper had free rein to get over as a heel, and where many of the top angles were shot. It was a remake of Rogers' Corner, with Buddy Rogers, except Rogers played the role of sage veteran babyface while Piper as the ultimate smartass punk heel. Have a coconut. He exploded with one of the most remembered angles of all time, the Piper's Pit segment with Snuka, where he hit Snuka in the head with a coconut and Snuka fell through the Piper's Pit backdrop. Piper vs. Snuka headlined everywhere and drew big in most places, equal to Hogan in biggest markets. Piper was so hot that on November 26, 1984, he headlined Madison Square Garden against the Tonga Kid, a replacement for the injured, actually in rehab Snuka, and sold Madison Square Garden out without much of an undercard. For the most part, Piper was kept apart from Hogan during that first year, even though Hogan was the champion and top face, and Piper was clearly the top heel. They worked a few house shows in San Diego, Buffalo, Boston, Salt Lake City, and Phoenix, all with disqualification or count-out finishes. There were two reasons. One was that with WWF running 2 shows per night, it made sense to have Hogan and Piper on different shows as much as possible. The other is that Piper outright refused to lose clean to Hogan. The way Vince McMahon liked to book, Hogan did programs like Bob Backlund, Bruno Sammartino and Pedro Morales before him, where there may be DQ finishes and such in early matches, but in the end, there was a blow-off match that the champion won clean. Piper said what everyone else knew but wouldn't say, which was the WWF track record was that heels would get hot, have a big money-drawing run, lose to the champion, and then mostly work mid-cards. He felt that as long as he never lost to the champion, he would have enough steam to continue to be a main eventer. In fact, during his first run in WWF, through his first announced retirement angle in 1987, Piper only lost one match via pinfall, a Fijian death match to Snuka on July 20, 1984, at Kiel Auditorium in St. Louis in their third singles meeting in the city. So while the guys like Valentine, Iron Sheik and David Schultz continued to have jobs, they weren't headlining so much after their runs with Hogan. Randy Savage, years later, was an exception, as was Piper. So it was one of the biggest matches in the history of Madison Square Garden, the war to settle the score, on February 18, 1985. Even though the main event would air live on MTV, both Madison Square Garden and the Felt Forum were sold out with 24,000 fans for Hogan vs. Piper, in what was actually meant as an angle to set up what would be the biggest until that time, and with the benefit of historical perspective, the most important pro wrestling event in history. The show drew a 9.1 rating to this day, still the highest rated pro wrestling show in the history of cable television. Hogan beat Piper via DQ, but the result was less important than Piper attacking just-turned babyface Lou Albano, and threatened rock star Cyndi Lauper, until Mr. T made the save, to set up the first Wrestlemania on March 31, 1985. The main event was Hogan and Mr. T vs. Piper and Paul Orndorff, with Snuka and Bob Orton Jr., who played Piper's bodyguard Ace, with the perpetually broken arm and cast he would use as a weapon, in the respective corners. Muhammad Ali was to be the referee, although the day of the show, when it became clear Ali was so far gone that he could not handle the job, it was switched and Pat Patterson took over. That had a secondary purpose, as Patterson, the booker, being in the ring, could help guide Mr. T, who was totally inexperienced and just told to do what he knew from his days as a champion high school wrestler. All Ali did was, when given the cue, he counted as Mr. T pinned Orndorff. Mr. T got cold feet the day of the show and nearly no-showed. A tough street fighter and bouncer, Mr. T, unlike most Americans who saw his scowl and delivery, and bought that the B.A. Baracus character on the 18 was real and thought he was one of the toughest bouncers and street fighters, he knew his limitations. One of the reasons for the success of Wrestlemania is people didn't believe the wrestlers were real, but they believed Mr. T was very real and that the fake big mouth Pipers was going to pay for his taunting him. Mr. T felt if he got beat up, his character and image would be dead. A few months earlier, one of the WWF wrestlers, David Schultz, evidently mad because Mr. T had come into his profession, went after him at a show in Los Angeles. Schultz was a lot bigger and had his own street fighter rep in pro wrestling as being a tough guy. He never got to T and ended up being fired by WWF, but T didn't know if somebody would try and make a real-world reputation off him. Piper was supposed to get pinned by Mr. T at the first Wrestlemania, since he was the guy who the heat was with. He refused, and Orndorff instead did the job. It was that reputation that was the reason the second Wrestlemania match, a boxing match with Piper vs. Mr. T, was such a disaster, although the disaster led to Piper's babyface turn. Because of the boxing gloves, even a worked boxing match requires a degree of boxing training just for the conditioning of the arms and shoulders and legs to move unbelievably and be able to hold up gloves past a short period of time. Piper had a boxing background and went to train as a boxer for the fight. Mr. T was supposed to train with Joe Frazier, but would never show up. He had told people he couldn't afford to, because if he sparred and some real boxer put him down, the boxer would gain a worldwide reputation, and his reputation would be shot. So he showed up out of shape for such a match. He and Piper did a few practice runs of the match and they were disastrous. From those who saw them, the finished product of that match was actually better than expected, even though it was still pretty bad. While Hogan and Piper as the two big stars were generally drawing well, Vince McMahon's business tactics of spending big money to buy television time in the different markets, the huge cost of running so many shows nationally and the problems they were having in drawing in some markets left the company in financial straits. They had fallen way behind on some of their television and production bills. But there was an influx of cash from New Japan Pro Wrestling to book talent, and a $1 million check from Jim Crockett Promotions to buy the TBS contract, so at the time they were very much solvent. You'll never see me shave my hair into a mohawk and paint myself black. But WrestleMania itself was a gigantic gamble. It was an expensive undertaking. Pay-per-view was in its infancy. It did exist and there were a few companies that carried the first WrestleMania. But for the most part, it would be a closed-circuit show. The WWF rented out 200 arenas, many of them major, throughout North America. Madison Square Garden sold out instantly for the live event. In WWF's strongest markets, ticket sales were good. But that wasn't the case in most of the country. A week out, based on advances, it looked like it would be a major financial bloodletting. McMahon's company, not cash-rich at the time, could not afford a failure. Whether they truly would have gone out of business had the show flopped, or been able to find partners to refinance the company is something we'll never know. McMahon has stated that had the show failed, the company would have had to declare bankruptcy. The belief at the time in wrestling was this was a do or die. They canceled 67 showings where advance ticket sales were poor. But over the last week, WrestleMania exploded, largely due to doors that were opened by the star power of Mr. T. The show drew 400,000 fans in 133 closed-circuit locations, and ended up as a major success. McMahon had taken in more money in one day than most of his competitors did in a year. While there were markets it did not do well in, the die was cast and the existing promoters no longer had the type of economic resources to compete. As Ernie Ladd said days after the show, the war is over, it's just that they don't know it yet. If any of the three elements, the wrestling super babyface in Hogan, the mainstream superstar T, and the super antagonist to both, Piper, were not part of the equation, the show would probably not have succeeded. Orndorff could have been replaced by Orton, or John Studd, or almost anyone. Piper, with his wit and race-baiting Mr. T, could not have been replaced. There were only a couple of guys in the business who could have been put in that position and pulled it off. Years later, Piper always felt he never got his just due when people looked back at the success of that show and really the success of the expansion of WWF. The success was credited to Hogan, although really Mr. T was the most important component. But Mr. T just doing pro wrestling would not have meant nearly as much without somebody to beat up. And Piper was not only the right guy, but had the right build-up and got some mainstream name recognition from Piper's Pit being the forum of the Cyndi Lauper/Lou Albano angle that this all kicked off from. You do not throw rocks at a man who has a machine gun. After Piper's death, it was written that Piper was one of the greatest heels in pro wrestling history. And while he was, the irony of that is that with the exception of a forgettable run long after his prime, he had not been a heel since the fans turned him babyface in early 1986. It was at WrestleMania 2, where he faced Mr. T in a boxing match. Mr. T had started getting passé, and like with most great heels, fans started figuring out how good they were and started to appreciate them. Piper was cheered in the match, and came out of it as a face. Immediately, he was the number 2 face behind Hogan until retiring to start a movie career. He made repeated comebacks, sometimes treated as a legend, and sometimes not. In the late 90s, during the Monday Night Wars, Piper had surprised WWF by taking a bigger money WCW offer. He started out on top, reviving his feud with Hogan. This time both men were older, and had a different perspective. Hogan put Piper over clean the first time with a sleeper, but in a non-title match, allowing Hogan to then get his clean win when the title was at stake. Hogan vs. Piper was still box office magic in WCW at first, but Piper was one of many stars in the WCW cast of characters and it was a source of great frustration. His mind worked in different ways. He was paranoid and felt disrespected. For a long period of time, Piper would travel everywhere with Johnny Fairplay, long before Fairplay made a name from reality TV. Once, when both were loaded and Fairplay was trying to get Piper out of a club before big problems erupted, they ended up in a serious car accident. Both were injured. Piper even disappeared. While obviously this wasn't the case, Piper would claim that the guy he hired, Fairplay, had tried to kill him. He felt WCW management and the younger generation of wrestlers had little to no respect for what he had accomplished and his role in the history of wrestling. His work wasn't good at this point, but he remained a push commodity because he was still a huge superstar to the public that remembered him from his 80s heyday. After he was fired by WCW in a cost-cutting move in 2000, Piper had his runs in both WWF and TNA. His once great promos were anything but during much of the TNA run. Yet, at times sometimes out of nowhere, and usually on Raw, he'd be put in a position to work with a top star, like John Cena, Steve Austin or Chris Jericho, and be positively brilliant. Ironically, since he was an experienced actor by that point, he was very good at following a script and excellent at delivery. Left to his own devices, the once charming and amazing rambling promos, if he had to do them on his own, would often go nowhere. Writing about Piper's career can be difficult. While Piper himself did numerous interviews, and spoke openly to those he chose as friends, most of his stories were contradictory or didn't add up. Eventually those stories became his reality. It wasn't like Hulk Hogan, who appeared to be totally self-aware that he was telling stories, as Piper in time seemed to believe his stories. His Twitter rants blaming Steve Austin for being fired from Podcast One when he actually quit, but in his own mind, he could tie it to Austin even though it was a stretch, was the most recent example. He had a Twitter altercation with Kevin Nash over a 1997 dressing room incident. I didn't know Piper well, but a few years later, when we actually talked at length a few times, the incident with Nash came up, on more than one occasion. My sense was it was in his mind the lack of respect for him among newer wrestlers, when his generation of top stars all respected his talents. While not the toughest guy in the world by any means, Piper was a tough guy, and had a reputation for being fearless. When Flair would go to dangerous parts of the world as world champion and bring someone to watch his back in the ring, he sometimes brought Piper along. Granted, a lot of it was because Flair also loved hanging around with Piper, and they remained close friends for 35 years. He had made demands of Vince McMahon that nobody would dare do, and got away with it. He would get into trouble with every promoter he worked for during his heyday, with the possible exception of Don Owen, but because he could draw money, he always had a place to land on his feet. On June 9, 1997, after a Nitro show in Boston, Nash came into Piper's dressing room to complain about a terrible main event match with he and Scott Hall against Piper and Ric Flair, earlier that night on a card which set what was at the time WCW's all-time attendance and gate record. The early part of the match consisted of Flair and Hall brawling in one corner, and Piper and Nash in the other. Nash claimed that Piper wasn't doing what they agreed on doing, although Nash also wasn't selling Piper's offense much and making him look weak. The agreed-upon match story was that Piper would do the selling, to build to Flair's hot tag. But that part of the match was horrible, and even with the star power in the ring, the match was dead. Piper then called for the finish at the 6 minutes mark of a match on live television booked to go 12 minutes, which meant a post-match brawl scheduled for after the match to go off the air with, had to go 6 minutes longer than scheduled. According to reports we got the night of the show, Nash went to Piper's private dressing room and knocked on the door very hard. Craig Malley, a pro wrestler who Piper had hired as his bodyguard, opened the door. Nash pie-faced Piper into the wall. Piper tried to kick Nash in his bad knee before Malley and Flair acted as the peacemakers and quickly broke things up before anything serious took place. But it also left the heat between the two unresolved. Another version of the story is that Nash and Malley nearly went at it, but Malley backed down. When Piper told me about the story, he always made a point that he wasn't scared of Nash because he had in the past been around a Mad Andre the Giant, and next to Nash, that was a lot scarier of a situation. But the reality is that Andre always liked Piper, so the situation was not the same. But he remained very bitter at Nash. He also made a point that when he was in trouble, his bodyguard ran away. Plus, most of the internal heat was on Piper, and not Nash, for not doing what was planned in the ring and then calling for the finish early. There had been problems from an earlier six-man tag match in Charlotte, Flair's hometown, with Flair and Piper and Kevin Green versus Hall and Nash and Sean Waltman. Flair and Piper at first didn't want Waltman in the match because they felt he wasn't a big enough star at the time to be in that big of a match. Hall and Nash wanted him in because he was the worker of the team and the guy who would make the match better. Plus, WCW wanted Green to turn on Flair, and Green refused. WCW wanted the heels to go over, and Piper, who had creative control, refused. Piper then suggested a singles match with Waltman, because he personally liked him and thought he was a great worker. And Piper wanted to prove something to people who thought he was there and on top simply due to his past reputation, and he wanted to have a great match. Eventually Hall and Nash and Waltman agreed to basically all do the job to show that they were professional. Piper's family set up a private funeral on the morning of August 11th in Portland, the day after the SmackDown tapings in the city, which would allow the WWE wrestlers to attend. His friends in Los Angeles, where he spent much of his time, have set up a memorial service on August 17th at the Comedy Store in Hollywood, also by invitation only. The location is fitting because in recent months, Piper had talked with friends about wanting to reinvent himself as a stand-up comedian. Piper's life before wrestling was difficult to document. He was born in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, but claimed a bad childhood and left his family and fended for himself by the time he was a teenager. At one point he lived in Toronto and later found pro wrestling in Winnipeg. He was trained by Tony Condello, a local independent promoter. He had done some Golden Gloves boxing. He had quick hands, which was evident in his ring style where he used boxing combinations for a lot of his offense. His other unique talent was his ability to play the bagpipes. He became known as Roddy the Piper as his nickname, so his wrestling name, from day one, was Roddy Piper. He worked on a small circuit in Manitoba for Condello starting in the summer of 1973. Piper always claimed that he was 17 years old in his first match, where he wrestled 300-pound Larry Hennig, and set the all-time wrestling record by losing in 13 seconds. His first recorded AWA match was a loss to fellow local wrestler Bobby Jones on an October 25, 1973 show at the Winnipeg Arena. He worked AWA shots in Manitoba and North Dakota as a prelim wrestler along with a local indie circuit. He was very skinny for the time by the standards of major league wrestlers, and he looks to have always lost his AWA matches. There was a Hennig match, on April 25, 1974, that he actually lost in 2 minutes, but he'd been wrestling about a year by that time. Piper also wrestled some in Montreal that year, and over the summer, worked in New Brunswick for Emile Dupree. He claimed that he lived and trained with Mad Dog Vachon that summer, and he claimed Vachon as his teacher. Vachon's daughter remembers living with Piper briefly, but it was a few months later, and in Texas. He taught me how to be a man, Piper said. Vachon gave him a nickname back then, Cocksucker. The last time I saw him was when he was inducted in the WWE Hall of Fame, he told Bertrand Hebert in the Vachon biography. He didn't recognize me at first. Then something flashed and he said, Cocksucker. I remember you, and he told me about the riot we were in together in Chicoutimi. That was a crazy night. He was fighting Jos Luke in a cage and people tried to attack the wrestlers. He had told me to go get the car ready because no one would recognize me since I was just a jobber. He was right. Nobody cared about me. After the match, as things were falling apart, Gypsy Joe had to stop a kid from attacking Maurice with a tire iron as they were exiting the building. Maurice got to the car and told me, "Start the car, cocksucker." Vachon had a brief run in WWF after leaving the AWA. He was in his late 50s and it was never going to work. Time stood still in the AWA, so the older fans who remembered Vachon as world champion in the 60s and as Vern Gagne's Art Tribal were willing to go with the idea that the broken down, small, old, slow Mad Dog was still the killer he once was, plus he could still talk the talk. But with the younger huge bodybuilders that McMahon was featuring, Mad Dog didn't fit at all. Still, Piper claimed that to himself. The most important Piper's Pit ever to him was one few even remembered took place. When he came back to the WWF, I wanted to give back to him so much, but there was really no way I could give back enough, he said. I was so proud of all the knowledge I got from him. On a personal level, and I never told that to anyone, but the Piper's Pit I did with him was the most important to me on a personal level. Snuka and the Coconut, Hogan and Andre, those were pieces of business. When I did it with Maurice, I wanted so much to tell the world how great he was and make them understand who he was for me. In November of 1974 he came to the U.S. and got his first full-time job as a prelim wrestler, working for Bob Geigel's Central States Wrestling. In January, he came to Dallas. Vachon had recommended him to Booker Red Bastien, and liked him so much that Vachon put him over on Piper's first night in the promotion at the TV tapings in Fort Worth. But he ended up just being a guy on the card, and bounced around North America, working East and West Texas, as well as Eastern Canada over the summer. He actually won a couple of opening matches on AWA shows when he got back home to Winnipeg. Bastien recommended him to Don Owen in Portland, saying he had a 21-year-old good-looking babyface. After Owen agreed to take him, Bastien had a conversation with Leo Garibaldi, who was the booker of Mike LaBelle's older brother of Gene LaBelle, Southern California Territory. The office called Red Bastien in Texas. He was booking at the time, and asked if they had any good guys we could use. Remember Jeff Walton? who handled publicity, announced television, promoted some of the smaller towns, and was also used as the NWA representative for the Southern California market when the storylines called for an authority figure. Bastian said, "There's one kid just starting out, 20 to 21 years old, good little gimmick, doing the Scottish thing. I was talking to Don Owens about sending him up there, but you can have him for 3 weeks. Since he was only going to be here for 3 weeks, we had him doing jobs, but there was something about him." Garibaldi told the office that Piper had a lot of potential and told Owen and Piper that they wanted to keep him for a while. Then, on a Tuesday night in San Diego, Garibaldi decided he was going to turn him heel. Garibaldi told Mike LaBelle. LaBelle called Walton and told him to get on a flight immediately to San Diego, saying that Garibaldi was going to turn this babyface who had a lot of potential heel. "I don't want that," LaBelle said to Walton. "Get on an airplane and fly to San Diego and tell him I don't want Roddy Piper to be a heel." I go down there and started talking to Leo. He said, "Jeff, this kid is a natural-born heel. He'd draw big bucks for us, you'll see." Mike didn't like Leo anyway. I said, "Mike's in charge and he doesn't want him to turn heel." He said, "Do me a favor. Watch, I'm going to make him a heel." I watched. I never saw anything like that in my life. That was a pivotal moment in Roddy Piper's career. I went back and told Mike, "There's no way Roddy Piper can't be a heel. He's too good, take it from me. The guy is a natural-born heel." The next night they did TV at the Olympic Auditorium and just did a subtle tease for a Piper heel turn to show the boss. Mike saw it and liked it. He really drew big money. His interviews were fantastic. This was before he did the crazy interviews where half of the time you didn't understand what he was talking about. He was a terrific bump guy. We could beat Roddy Piper every night and he wouldn't lose anything. There were a lot of great stories, but a lot of them I couldn't really tell. His gimmick of coming to the ring wearing a kilt and playing the bagpipes was easy heat, and what set him apart and made him memorable. But that alone wasn't going to draw big houses or have any legs. One of the reasons he was so successful is because he was extreme at everything in life, which also proved to be his undoing at times. During the recreational party period of wrestling, Piper was off the charts. But he treated things as a shoot. He always used the term fights instead of matches. Walton remembered when John Tolos, a babyface at the time, was having a party at his house, and everyone was coming. Piper refused because he thought somebody might possibly see him on the road that wasn't part of the fraternity. During his nearly 3 years in Southern California, he was the lead heel most of the time, although had a babyface run as well. He did angles both good and whacked out. His main opponent was Chavo Guerrero. Their angles and interviews aired weekly on the Spanish International Network, now Univision. While the quality of the wrestling overall at that point had faded greatly from the glory days from a few years earlier, the show aired in more markets around the country than any other wrestling show. Piper against Chavo Guerrero, which also extended to Chavo's father Gory, and his brothers Mondo and Hector Guerrero, was one of the decade's most well-known feuds. Walton noted that to him, Piper never changed after he became a celebrity. Piper would see him, ask about his kids, and they would laugh a lot together. He joked about not making any money out here, but he didn't mind it, because the trips were short. He was sent to Senior, Vince McMahon's father, for a few Madison Square Garden shows, but it didn't pan out because he was still young, but he got his big break. Los Angeles was a crazy territory and did a lot of gimmicks with Piper. Some worked, and some didn't. In his 3 years he was the top heel, managed a stable, played heel ref after getting his NWA referee's license, and even had a storyline where he learned hypnosis and would illegally hypnotize his opponents, from a failed gimmick Gary Hart did in Australia. He also worked under a mask as Super Scorpion, and after losing A Loser Leaves Town, had a run as the Masked Canadian. He worked some for Roy Shire in 1978. In one of the great exposes of the business during that period, Piper and Moondog Lonnie Main were a heel tag team in Southern California. The matches from the Olympic Auditorium aired in San Francisco and Sacramento, two of Shire's best cities, on Sin. Shire, on the other hand, had turned main babyface years earlier, and he was the U.S. champion, and feuded on top with a heel Piper. I can't say that on its own led to the declining popularity of wrestling in the area at the time, because many factors were at work, but it was absolutely one of them. Even then, younger wrestlers started imitating his mannerisms, shaking his hair, saying, "Well, you know," and countless people copied his often cocaine-fueled promos, with his mind working a mile a minute like pro wrestling's predecessor to a young Robin Williams. Unlike superstar Billy Graham, who clearly took his promo style from Muhammad Ali, Dusty Rhodes, who took his from Ali and Graham, and Austin Idol, Jesse Ventura, and Hulk Hogan, who imitated Graham, Piper was the original that many imitated and nobody came close to duplicating. While Piper was no longer consistently great on promos over the past decade, he had his moments of brilliance in some WWE comebacks. Once, after one of them in working with a heel Jericho prior to the 2009 Wrestlemania match, Piper's last major WWE match, Jericho said that Piper was the Yoda of pro wrestling promos. Piper went to Oregon as a heel, but Buddy Rose was the king there with Ed Wiskoski as his sidekick. Piper and Bad News Brooks were the other top heel tag team, and in an angle, Rose and Wiskoski turned on an injured Brooks. Since he was returning home to Texas, Piper became a face. Piper vs. Rose was the hottest singles program the area had in about a decade. Piper ended up loving the area so much that he made it one of his two homes. For years, Piper would have one residence in Hollywood, while his family would live just outside Portland in the mountains of Hillsboro, Oregon. Piper was already a great talker in Los Angeles, and got even better in Oregon. But it was in the Carolinas, where the standard of workers and talkers were much higher, that he came into his own and rose to being the best promo in the business. Ric Flair dates two women at the same time. That way, when he falls asleep, they've got somebody to talk to. He was the top heel in the Carolinas, feuding with the likes of Flair, Wahoo McDaniel, Ricky Steamboat and Jack Briscoe. He would wear t-shirts that read, "I Scare Flair." Jim Barnett saw his work and came up with the idea of having him as the heel television announcer for Georgia Championship Wrestling. Barnett told me he hired Piper for $5,000 per month. Piper in his book claimed it as $5,000 per week. At the time, a ton of money for a guy who only came in on Saturday mornings and still worked full-time in the Carolinas as a headliner. Given what he was likely earning in the Carolinas, Piper was among the highest-paid wrestlers in the country by 1981. That wasn't always the best thing to be a 27-year-old heavy partier who was a television celebrity, good-looking, and with a lot of cash in your hands. He shined in that role, and may have been the best ever at it. Or perhaps he wasn't, but it seemed that way because he was the first to do it on national television. He was a heel, but not over the top. He actually called things, well, not exactly straight down the middle, but only leaned slightly heelish. He was always respectful to lead announcer Gordon Solie. He'd put over the faces, but then take a heelish dig by talking about how he'd approach the situation differently and how he'd beat them. It started out subtly and his heel persona started getting stronger as time went on. The first signs of a heel turn came in remarks made by Piper about Bob Armstrong. Armstrong was an older veteran, himself a top talker, whose son Brad had just started. The two were a father and son team who surprised everyone by winning the annual Thanksgiving night tag team tournament at the Omni in Atlanta in 1981. Piper would make remarks about Armstrong, who had the huge arms but he didn't have big legs, and make fun of him. Armstrong would compare his body to that of a racehorse, saying he was a southern-born, southern-bred thoroughbred. Piper would start criticizing the Armstrongs' tag team strategy, saying that the key to tag teams is having one guy work and take the beating for as long as possible, so he can tag the fresh partner while the opponents were the most tired. He said that Bob, as a father, would not let his son take the beating for a long enough time. Piper out-talked everyone, drawing more and more ire out of the fans. Except he'd always sell for Flair, who was a heel in Georgia, but the world title was always put over big, and Armstrong's verbal jousts. Finally, after months, it exploded with a studio brawl between Piper and Armstrong, which was the hottest moment of the year on Georgia television. He's as strong as an ox, and almost as smart. About Ole Anderson. Ole Anderson was the booker at the time. While the ratings of Georgia Championship Wrestling were through the roof and it was the first legitimate hit in the history of cable television, business was not that strong at the time. The closing of the Atlanta City Auditorium meant that, since the tradition was to run weekly, they would run the Omni regularly. Atlanta went from being the major profit center for the promotion to mostly a break-even proposition, drawing about 5,000 paid per week. That would have been awesome to draw that 3 times a week in the smaller building and then do a big show at the Omni every month or so that drew much bigger because they brought in outside talent and it was the Omni. But when every week was the Omni, the expense of the bigger building, and with running the Omni no longer making it inherently special, it was a struggle. Barnett had been patient, giving Piper nearly a year to get over. The program with Armstrong had built perfectly. Barnett was not attending the matches the night of the first Piper vs. Armstrong match, but the advance was the strongest of the year. Barnett usually stayed out of the booking, but he told Anderson, "Whatever you do, Piper has to win." Anderson had other ideas. Even though Armstrong was not his top babyface, he was a high mid-carder, but underneath Dusty Rhodes, Tommy Rich and Mr. Wrestling 2, and Piper was clearly the best heel. Anderson booked a non-finish, saying he didn't want a guy who wasn't full-time with his promotion. Piper was still going to be a Crockett guy and only work big shows for GCW, beating one of his full-time babyfaces. The show drew 12,000 fans. Barnett noted to me that Piper not winning softened the heat, as the idea was to use Armstrong as a stepping stone for Piper to face the bigger stars. When he never beat Bob, while he was a solid main event heel, he never popped a house like that again. While the fans turned Piper face in the WWF, it was a fan in a very different way, who did it in the Carolinas and Georgia. Piper was getting incredible heat, working a singles program with Jack Briscoe. There was a famous story that Flair once offered Piper money if he could take Briscoe, who in 1965 was the NCAA champion, down during a match. The idea is Piper would have the element of surprise going for him. Somehow, instinctively, Briscoe figured it would, and everyone got a laugh out of Piper blowing himself up and getting nowhere. Briscoe told him after that Piper could take him down anytime he wanted as a work, but not when it's a shoot. In Raleigh, Piper got stabbed by an irate fan. Since he'd been getting so much heat, this was not his first dangerous situation. The decision was made to turn him babyface. It looks like he just gave birth to a litter of kangaroos. About Jerry Lawler in Georgia, there wasn't even an angle. Gordon Soley just went on television with a story about how there was a madman at a schoolyard with a knife threatening children. Piper, in protecting children and subduing the man, got stabbed. To drive the matter home, Piper and Don Morocco ended up in an argument. As it got physical, Soley was in the middle and was accidentally knocked down. Keep in mind that Soley was virtually never part of wrestling angles. Even as a heel, Piper was always respectful to Mr. Soley, and went crazy seeing his older legendary broadcast partner knocked down. Piper was instantly the top face, but his problems were such that after car wrecks and missing a main event or two, Anderson fired him. Crockett had also fired him during that period. But, because he was so popular and entertaining, and he spoke to everyone like he was so humble and gracious at all times, not to mention he was big draw, Crockett brought him back. While people often remember the two big shows in 1983, the Steamboat and Youngblood vs. Slaughter and Kernodle show and the first Starrcade as the shows that launched Jim Crockett Promotions to new heights, it was months earlier, at the annual Thanksgiving show at the Greensboro Coliseum on November 25, 1982, that Flair vs. Piper in a babyface vs. babyface match for the NWA title set a then territory record with $15,496 paid. While Piper's best heel work was undoubtedly in WWF during the original Piper's Pit era, his mic work peak really was in the Carolinas and Georgia. It was probably his in-ring peak as well. Even though he worked a crazy schedule of almost nightly matches, the travel was far more grueling and taxing in that WWF era where they'd crisscross the country back and forth, often in the same week. After the Mr. T match at Wrestlemania 2, Piper's contract had expired. Because he was so famous, and actually could box, boxing people tried to recruit him, figuring he'd be a super drawing card as a white heavyweight. He turned down the offers. He came back, and was a babyface in a gay-bashing angle with Adrian Adonis. Adonis and Piper went way back. When Adonis was early in his career as Keith Franks, the two were tag team partners in California, as well as opponents. In one of the sillier angles in a promotion that had a lot of silly angles, Piper said he would be able to get Adonis to quit smoking. They were also together in Oregon, where Ron Starr and Adrian Adonis was a regular babyface tag team that worked against Piper and Brooks. Adonis then became a major star in the AWA as a heel tag team partner with Jesse Ventura, and was later part of one of the best tag teams of that era with Dick Murdoch. By this point Adonis, a super talent, but badly overweight, was playing the most overtly gay character possible. Piper's race-baiting promos that made him a heel became babyface gay-bashing promos as a face. None of these would fly today. Years later, when Chael Sonnen, who grew up watching Piper, went to him for advice for promos on Anderson Silva, Piper gave him advice. Times had changed greatly from Piper's programs with T and Adonis. Sonnen didn't use it, since that advice would have resulted in Sonnen's career being over and UFC probably losing television. In the angle with Adonis, Orton turned on Piper, and Morocco also joined Adonis in laying Piper out. They ended up putting lipstick on him, while destroying the Piper's Pit set. Piper vs. Adonis was the number 3 match at the Hogan vs. Andre Wrestlemania at the Pontiac Silverdome. It was a hair versus hair match. Piper had also announced that would be his final match. I came here to chew bubblegum and kick ass, and I'm all out of bubblegum. He did a lot of acting over the years, including his most famous role as the lead in the cult classic, They Live, where he fought aliens disguised as people. The movie had a 5-minute pro wrestling-inspired fight scene, and featured perhaps his most famous line ever. John Carpenter always claimed that Piper ad-libbed that line while filming. Ric Flair, you just called me a woman. Well, I want to know, how does it feel to get beat by a woman? He came back many times. With the exception of one match with Snuka, and multiple matches with best friend Flair, Piper still refused to lose matches by pinfall in WWF, until the 1992 Wrestlemania, where he put over Bret Hart for the Intercontinental title. Piper passed the torch to me at Wrestlemania, said Hart to Sports Illustrated. I think I was the first guy who pinned him in the ring. Roddy was one of the first guys to help make me into a main attraction. I was supposed to work, at one point, with Ultimate Warrior, but he never passed the torch to anybody. Hogan didn't have enough respect to put me over or help the next generation. When I think back about my career, with the exception of Mr. Perfect, Roddy Piper was the only guy who said, I'm going to help make one of these new guys into a star for the next generation. I'll never forget that. Roddy was always about business and trying to help the young guys, and he did that for me. Still, Piper was hard to explain. When Vince McMahon commissioned a hit piece on Hart, similar to the self-destruction of the Ultimate Warrior, for a DVD release, which saw interviews cut and later discarded when Hart agreed to do a DVD with McMahon, partially to avoid the other tape being done, and long before their ultimate business reconciliation, it was shocking to see that Piper was on the tape smearing him, because Piper always referred to the Hart family as his cousins. But still, Piper and Hart remained close friends. Piper had unique relations with a lot of people, constantly knocking promoters, including Vince McMahon, for how they abused talent and all the young deaths, yet always making up with him. He quit many times, and was fired once as well, for remarks made on a 2003 episode of HBO's Real Sports with Bryant Gumbel. He blamed the wrestling industry for its horrible track record of young deaths. Everybody's dead. They're all dying early and nobody cares about it. They take them and they screw them up so much. Piper said that the wrestling business has a great entrance plan, quick fame and adulation, but no exit plan. He said he was still wrestling at 49 years old because he couldn't touch his pension plan until he reaches 65. And then he said, I'm not going to make 65. WWE wrote in the release, Piper stated that he used drugs for many years while working in professional wrestling, and that he does not like the person that he becomes when he actively performs as a professional wrestler. They said they would help him out by having him no longer be a pro wrestler. He then went to TNA from 2003 to 2005, and returned to WWF in 2005, in a deal that included his being inducted into that year's Hall of Fame. But Piper also credited wrestling fans with saving his life. At the November 5, 2006 Cyber Sunday pay-per-view, Piper was among those to be chosen from to be tag team partner with Ric Flair to face the Spirit Squad that night. The angle was designed to team Flair with Dusty Rhodes, but the fans instead picked Piper. Piper was feeling terrible while on a European tour for WWF, and was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, which, because it was caught in its early stages, he beat it. This is the end of this conversion. Be sure to comment and subscribe. See you next time.